How Simo Häyhä became the White Death. In the winter of 1939, Finland found itself facing a war in which almost no one outside the country believed the forces were equal. On one side stood the Soviet Union, a vast state with millions of soldiers, tanks, artillery, aircraft, and political confidence that a small northern nation would not be able to resist for long. On the other side stood Finland, a land of forests, lakes, marshes, snow, and severe cold. A country with a small population, limited military resources, and an army that could not defeat its opponent by numbers alone. But war does not always obey arithmetic. Sometimes terrain, weather, discipline, and human endurance change events more powerfully than headquarters maps can predict. It was in this kind of war that one man appeared whose enemy would remember him by a name that sounded almost like an ancient northern legend, the White Death. His name was Simo Häyhä. He was not a general, did not command armies, and did not give speeches that would enter textbooks. Before the war, he lived a simple rural life in Finland. He was a farmer, a hunter, and a man accustomed to forests, silence, weapons, and long waiting. There was nothing theatrical about him. He was short, calm, reserved, and almost unnoticeable. But that very unnoticeability became his greatest weapon. He did not try to look frightening. He did not build a legend around himself. He simply knew how to do what, under the conditions of the Winter War, became a deadly and precise art. Wait, observe, remain unseen, and fire only when error was no longer possible. To understand why Simo Häyhä became such a powerful symbol, it is necessary first to understand the Winter War itself. In the autumn of 1939, relations between Finland and the Soviet Union grew increasingly tense. Moscow demanded territorial concessions from Helsinki, especially on the Karelian Isthmus, explaining that it needed to move the border farther from Leningrad. Finland saw these demands not only as a question of Soviet security, but as a dangerous step that could threaten its independence. Negotiations failed, and on November 30th, 1939, Soviet troops crossed the border. In Moscow, many expected the campaign to be quick and the resistance of a small country to collapse. Finland did not collapse. The Finns could not compete with the Soviet Union in the number of tanks, guns, and aircraft, so they fought differently. They used what they knew better than the enemy: their own land, their forests, their winter roads, their marshes, their snow, and their frost. Soviet columns often moved along narrow roads surrounded by dense forest. For a large army, a road was a necessity because vehicles, artillery, and supplies all required routes. But for Finnish units, that same road became an opportunity. If a column stretched out, it could be cut into pieces, struck at a weak point, and forced to fight in fragments instead of as one powerful machine. This became a war not only of weapons, but of nerves. Frost turned metal into pain, damaged equipment, exhausted men, complicated supply, and made every mistake heavier. A soldier poorly prepared for the northern winter suffered not only from enemy fire, but from the environment itself. In the forest, sound changed. Distances deceived the eye, white camouflage could hide a man almost completely, and stillness became not weakness, but advantage. Finnish ski troops moved quickly and quietly, appearing where they were not expected. They could not always stop a major attack head-on, but they could make it slow, painful, and costly. Simo Häyhä was the kind of man who fit such a war almost perfectly. He had grown up in a world where hunting was not entertainment, but a skill connected with patience, observation, and respect for nature. A hunter understands that the forest does not forgive haste. He knows how the wind behaves, how sound travels between trees, how light reflects from snow, and how the movement of a branch differs from the movement of an animal. On the front, that knowledge did not disappear. It became a military advantage. Häyhä did not come to the army as an empty man who had to learn how to see. He already knew how to look at the world in the way a sniper must. His position on the front was not a beautiful scene from a film. He did not sit in a comfortable tower, look through an expensive telescopic sight from a warm shelter, and choose targets in safety. His workplace was snow, earth, forest, frost, and stillness. He wore white camouflage, lay so that his outline disappeared, and could remain almost motionless for hours. Under such conditions, the body begins to fight against the mind. Cold passes through clothing, fingers stiffen, breath becomes visible, muscles demand movement, and the mind must remain clear. One mistake could cost not only his life, but also the lives of the men near him. Many of the methods he used sound simple only when described. He packed down the snow in front of his rifle barrel so the shot would not throw up a visible cloud of powdery snow. He held snow in his mouth so that warm breath would not turn into vapor and reveal his position. He chose his place so his head would not rise too high above cover and his weapon would not catch the light. He did not rely on chance and did not turn shooting into excitement. That was his strength. He did not fight dramatically, he fought correctly. One of the best-known details of his story is that he preferred a rifle without a telescopic sight. To a modern viewer, this can seem strange, because the sniper is almost automatically associated with optics. But in the conditions of the Winter War, that choice made practical sense. A scope could glint in sunlight, frost over, fog up, or force the shooter to raise his head higher than necessary. Iron sights were lower, simpler, and more reliable, and Häyhä was experienced enough to use them with extraordinary accuracy. This does not mean optics were useless. It means that for a specific man, on a specific front, in a specific winter environment, simplicity could be an advantage. His weapon was a Finnish version of the Mosin rifle. It was reliable, familiar, and well-suited to a man who understood its behavior. But a rifle does not create a legend by itself. A weapon becomes frightening only when it joins with skill, discipline, and endurance in the hands of a person. Häyhä did not shoot to impress anyone. He fired when the target was chosen, the distance judged, the position preserved, and the risk justified. There was no romance in that. It was craftsmanship carried to its limit. Fear of a sniper differs from fear of other weapons. Artillery fire can be heard and seen, even if it is hard to escape. A tank occupies space, crushes the road with its tracks, roars with its engine, and becomes an obvious threat. An aircraft can often be heard before it appears overhead. But a sniper acts differently. He does not announce himself openly, does not occupy the battlefield like a large force, but dissolves into it. After one shot, a soldier no longer fears only death. He begins to fear the space around him. Every snowdrift, every tree, and every shadow between the trunks may seem like the place from which the next bullet will come. That is why Häyhä's work mattered not only because of the number of targets he hit. It changed the behavior of the enemy. Men began to move more carefully, more slowly, more nervously. They spent time searching for an invisible shooter, fired at suspicious places, called in artillery or mortars against a spot where perhaps no one remained. A sniper forces the enemy to think about him even when he is silent. This psychological pressure is especially strong in forest and snow, where the human eye is easily deceived and silence becomes not peace, but threat. In this way, a legend began to form around Häyhä. He became known as the White Death, a name that entered military history and became part of the image of the Winter War. White, because he operated in snow, in white camouflage, among a winter landscape where the boundary between man and environment could disappear. Death, because his shots were precise, sudden, and frighteningly unseen. Such names rarely come from official orders. They appear where fear combines with repetition. One man falls, then another, then a third, and the source of danger still cannot be seen. For Finland, figures like this carried enormous moral weight. The country was fighting an opponent incomparably larger, and it needed symbols of endurance. But it is important to understand that Häyhä was not a separate miracle who alone stopped the war. He was part of the broader Finnish defense, part of the same spirit shown by ski troops, by the defenders of the Mannerheim Line, by artillerymen, signalmen, medics, commanders, and ordinary soldiers. His story became famous because in one man, the qualities needed by the whole country became unusually clear. Endurance, knowledge of the land, cold discipline, and refusal to surrender before a greater force. The Soviet side tried to deal with this invisible opponent. Against a sniper, one can use counter-snipers, mortars, artillery, forest searches, smoke, decoys, and maneuver. But none of these methods gives certainty when the man is well hidden, does not hurry, and knows how to change position. In a winter forest, the search for a sniper becomes an exhausting hunt in which hunter and prey constantly change roles. If a soldier lifts his head too high, tries to see the danger, or makes one careless movement, he himself may become the target. The number of opponents Häyhä hit became a subject of fame and debate. The figure most often mentioned is more than 500 rifle kills during the short span of the Winter War, sometimes with additional claims involving a submachine gun. Such numbers must be handled carefully because war always produces reports, legends, propaganda, incomplete testimony, and post-war retellings. But even if the numbers are treated strictly and without blind worship, the central fact remains clear. Häyhä became one of the most effective and most famous snipers in history, and his influence was not only statistical but psychological. At the same time, there was nothing supernatural about him. This is essential for a strong telling of the story. Legend often turns a person into something almost ghost-like, as if he cannot be wounded and cannot be found. But Häyhä was human. He froze, grew tired, risked his life, felt pressure, and understood that war does not forgive overconfidence. His advantage was not magic, but consistency. He repeated the correct actions again and again without letting emotion destroy them. He chose his position, hid his breath, controlled movement, prevented the weapon from shining, and fired only when it made sense. Here an important truth about mastery appears. From the outside, mastery often looks mysterious, almost inexplicable. Inside, it is made of many small things done correctly. A man does not become a legendary sniper because he once made a spectacular shot. He becomes one because every day, under harsh conditions, he preserves attention to detail. He does not move when he wants to move. He stays silent when sound would betray him. He waits when he wants to hurry. He gives up comfort for invisibility. This is not a beautiful pose. It is heavy discipline. The Winter War as a whole was a conflict in which small details carried enormous weight. Soviet forces had great power, but they often faced poor preparation for specific conditions, difficult terrain, insufficient coordination, and determined resistance. Finnish soldiers could not cancel the enemy's numerical superiority, but they could make every advance costly. They used tactics often described through the idea of cutting columns into isolated sections, turning a large formation into separate pockets vulnerable to attack. In such a war, snipers, ski troops, small groups, and knowledge of the land became especially important. For ordinary Soviet soldiers, the campaign was also tragic and brutal. They marched into an unfamiliar winter country where forests, frost, and roads became enemies as real as the Finnish army. Many had not chosen this war and had no personal hatred for the people they were ordered to fight. They obeyed commands, froze, came under fire, got lost, suffered from poor supply, and died in the snow. For that reason, the story of the White Death must be told carefully. A powerful military story should not turn the opponent into a faceless mass. Behind each side stood human beings, not only symbols. Yet against this wider human tragedy, the image of Häyhä becomes especially expressive. He shows how one man can become the embodiment of the environment in which he fights. Finland could not be stronger than the Soviet Union in industrial scale, but it could be stronger on a particular stretch of forest, in a particular snowdrift, in a particular ambush, in the particular second before a shot. Häyhä was not only a marksman, but an expression of the Finnish logic of defense. Deny a larger force the chance to use its strength where it wants, and make it suffer where a smaller force knows every meter. Over time, Soviet soldiers began to perceive him as a special threat. Different means were used to destroy positions where he might be hiding. That only strengthened the legend. If artillery is used against one shooter, then he has become something more than an ordinary soldier. The enemy wanted to remove not only a man with a rifle, but a source of constant anxiety. An invisible opponent is dangerous because he is present even when he is absent. He lives in the expectation of the next shot. But war does not allow a man to remain a legend forever without payment. In March 1940, shortly before the end of the Winter War, Häyhä was severely wounded. A bullet or fragment struck him in the face, causing terrible damage. His jaw was shattered, his face disfigured, and he lost consciousness. Details of the scene differ in retellings, but the essence remains the same. The man many had come to imagine as almost untouchable proved to be as vulnerable as any soldier in war. He was carried from the battlefield, and he survived, although the wound was so severe that his survival itself seems extraordinary. When he regained consciousness, the war was almost over. In March 1940, a peace treaty was signed. Finland preserved its independence but lost significant territories. For the country, the outcome was bitter. It had not been destroyed, but it had paid a heavy price. The Soviet Union gained territorial concessions, but the campaign had been far more difficult and bloody than expected. To the world, Finland became a symbol of a small country resisting a massive power, and Simo Häyhä became one of the strongest symbols of that endurance. After the war, he endured a long recovery. His face remained permanently changed, but he did not turn his life into an endless theater of wartime glory. He lived quietly, hunted, raised dogs, and worked his land. There was a particular restraint in that, and it makes his image stronger. Some people create their own myth, constantly retelling the past, emphasizing their own exceptionality, and demanding attention. Häyhä was different. He seemed like a man who did not need the legend, even though the legend already existed independently of him. When asked how he had become such an accurate shooter, his answers were simple. He spoke of practice. There is no dramatic flourish in that answer, but there is truth. Mastery rarely appears from a single moment of inspiration. It is born from repetition, habit, calm, and long labor. To someone who wants only drama from military history, such an answer may seem too dry. But that is exactly where the strength lies. Häyhä did not explain his accuracy through mysticism, fate, or being chosen. He explained it through training and duty. The story of the White Death remains powerful because it connects several levels at once. On the first level, it is the story of a sniper who became one of the most famous marksmen in the world. On the second, it is the story of a small country resisting a vast power. On the third, it is the story of how an environment can become a weapon when people know how to use it properly. On the fourth, it is a story about the price of war, because behind the image of a precise shooter stand the wounded, the dead, the frozen, the lost, and those who returned home no longer the same. If one image could contain the whole story, it would not be a parade and not a loud attack. It would be a winter forest, a road between trees, snow that muffles footsteps, air so cold that breathing itself becomes dangerous. Tired soldiers move forward, trying to understand where the enemy is. They look at the trees, the snowdrifts, the white spaces between trunks, but see nothing. Somewhere in that space lies a man who has already become part of winter. He does not hurry. He does not reveal himself. He waits for the moment when one exact shot will matter more than 10 useless ones. In that image there is everything: fear, cold, mastery, unequal forces, and the merciless simplicity of war. Häyhä was not thunder falling on the battlefield. He was the silence after which a man suddenly understands that danger is already here. That is why his image survived for decades. He became not merely a name in a list of snipers, but a symbol of how an unnoticeable man can become enormous in the memory of war. The strongest version of this story is the one that does not simplify it. Simo Häyhä did not win the Winter War alone. He was not a fairy tale figure who single-handedly stopped an army. He was a soldier of his country, acting as part of a broader defense, but his personal mastery became so striking that history separated him from thousands of others. There is no contradiction in that. Great wars are made of enormous processes, but memory often preserves them through individual human lives. The White Death is the story of a man who did not seek a loud role, but found himself in a war where his qualities became decisive. He knew the forest, the snow, the rifle, and patience. He understood that sometimes strength lies not in movement, but in stillness. He showed that discipline can be more frightening than rage, and precision more powerful than noise. To his opponents, he seemed less like a single man than like the Finnish winter itself, firing from the white landscape and vanishing before it could be reached. That is why the story still draws attention today. It contains a clear, dramatic contrast. Small Finland against the huge Soviet Union, one short farmer against a military machine, a rifle without optics against artillery, tanks, and numerical superiority. But behind that contrast is not fantasy, but the harsh logic of war. The one who understands place, conditions, and weapon better can become far more dangerous than appearances suggest. When the name Simo Häyhä is spoken in military history today, it is not only the name of a sniper. It is a reminder that war is measured not only by the number of divisions and the caliber of guns. War is also measured by endurance, attention, knowledge of the land, willingness to suffer cold and fear, and the ability to complete a task without unnecessary words. That force once went to the winter front in white camouflage, lay down in the snow with a simple rifle, and became the legend the enemy remembered as the White Death.